Erica had started a 3-hour session with a very high caliber group that's been with them, I guess, some for decades. And you could see that it's an ecosystem, not unlike ours. The difference being, by the way, that a series of papers that they do, and then they present and discuss, and then people are commenting in the chat, and it's almost like a mini TED Talk in a way, the way you sort of provide some content and then have the group discussion. Really
right. Well, yeah, and it was so wonderful to have you join, and I'm sure so many people on this call will understand this. I mean, these used to be almost 7-hour full day sessions where we would convene most of our clients around one big table, present these 6 themes, and then open it up for discussion. Like everything else, we've had to kind of pivot on the fly the last couple of quarters as we've kind of morphed this virtually. But we've been able to make it work. And, Mark, too, you get a lot of powerful voices in one space with people with a lot of things to say. And it can either be unwieldy or magic can happen. And it's always nice to get those different perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, you had someone on who was working in Homeland Security. You had, former head of innovation at GE. Some Michigan people I've already connected to, since this is an alumni theme. Was it Marnie?
Oh yeah, Marnie's one of my favorites. She's work family, and she's a retail powerhouse. She's hysterical. Yeah, I forgot that she went to Michigan. That's right.
Yeah, no, she said, looks like we're going to have a football team this year, playing this year. Well, look, all right, so I wanted to give it 5 minutes to get everybody on. Francis, I hope you appreciate that we didn't start at 11 here with you.
Thank you.
This is, yesterday was all about, the financial markets, and then we went into these industry groups, although impact was an interesting theme. I really, I was saying earlier, I got to sit in on a session that Erica and her team ran, and I like this dynamic of sort of thinking outside the box and thinking, of what's coming around the corner, what's happening in front of us. We just maybe not recognizing them as sort of systematic forces, and so they provide insights and a discipline, and then I guess it's sort of a sister ecosystem that I really think could be good for everybody involved. So I'm going to hand off this initial portion to Erica. And Erica, we purposely gave you more time. We didn't try to put you into the Timplosion.
I appreciate that, Mark. Thank you.
And so I think, there's lots of directions, just like that tree, of competencies, a lot of directions and roots and ways, ancillary themes that I also saw that of course interrelate. So don't feel rushed here. We'll have Q&A as we go through the hour. And again, what we're thinking is, and I really enjoyed what you did before, you also took a 10-minute break. So I think we might introduce that so like at 8:50, we take a 10-minute break. Plus that helps me get everybody aligned in the breakouts. And then we're going to make the debrief, make those sessions a little shorter so that we all come back here by 9:30, and by 10 o'clock, you're off to your whatever races you all have. So again, thank you everybody for joining. I'm going to, stop sharing my screen. So Erica, you can share yours.
Perfect. Yeah. So Mark, thank you so much for having me back. Good morning, everybody. I too am armed with a nice big cup of coffee here, as I'm on the East Coast, not as early as those of you who have joined from the West Coast. So I'm not going to share my screen yet. I want to just spend a few minutes walking you guys through kind of a big conceptual future, kind of put some of these macro forces first within context, and then use that as a springboard to then delve into one of the frameworks that we've created internally. So just as a top note, our firm, The Future Hunters, identifies long-term trends. So we are constantly identifying the intersection between sociocultural trends, technological, economic, political, demographic, environmental, really the list goes on. Knowing that really the one thing we always have to have our eye on that is industry agnostic and in many ways trend agnostic is change. It's looking at the direction of change and where it is moving. And one of the things that we've really felt, and we're not alone in this. All of you have probably felt this as well, is that the phase that we are in right now is that of accelerated change. And I've long talked about the fact that change was always experienced geometrically. And then, it's so cliche in kind of B-school circles where they talk about hockey stick growth, but all of us were feeling that exponential rate of change. But now it's as if our foot is on the pedal and we've hit the gas and we're feeling this rapid acceleration of almost everything. And we feel that these changes came on almost overnight, and all of these global circumstances have changed dramatically. But one of the core messages, and one of the things that I really want to drive home first, is this whole idea that it's very easy to get stuck in kind of the dystopian nature of this. Think of all of the challenges or a lot of the fears or anxieties that a time of such rapid change can cause, and flip that narrative and really start thinking of what some of those opportunities are. But before we kind of delve into the meat of this, there are two core assumptions that I have to break out of when thinking about the future. I see my clients struggling with this, and it's human nature to struggle with. So I want to first tackle two of those core assumptions, kind of get our heads screwed on right when thinking about the future, and help you guys just kind of get out of your mindsets a little bit. Now, one of the buzzwords that's circulating out there a lot is adaptation. And I kind of go against the grain when I think about adaptation, because I think the first assumption that we make about the future is that it requires adaptation. And when viewed within this lens, many people are still under that illusion that somehow the world, and in turn business, will in many ways just return back to the way in which it once was. So when viewed within this lens of adaptation, it assumes that we will go back to a new normal of sorts. And everyone now is talking about this new normal. That we will go back to a place that may resemble some facet of our past, some facet of our previous way of working or living or socializing or learning. And it's more about using the past to modify and adjust to new conditions. But we need to get accustomed to the fact that this isn't going to get us to where we need to go, because adaptation, honestly, is not what we're even talking about here. And it shouldn't be how we frame the future. We need to think in terms of not just imagination, but reimagination and rediscovery. So when we pivot away from just pure adaptation, then different opportunities can kind of form in our field of vision. Now, the second assumption that I want to tackle is that we spend a lot of time talking about the pandemic. We talk a lot of time speaking about this post-pandemic world and this new normal. And we think that COVID is directly responsible for everything that is happening now. But again, this is within a lens of adaptation, because adaptation assumes that what we're reacting to is a pandemic. But we need to reframe our thinking because of a pandemic, that we need to reconfigure what it is that we do because of a pandemic, that we need to reimagine because of a pandemic. But rather, what we are experiencing now is just one small block in a much larger pyramid. And you have to first see the foundational aspects of that pyramid before you can really understand where this post-pandemic world is going to take us. So I want to just rewind back and kind of take you guys through the 20,000-foot view of the future, because for everyone that's talking about 2020 being this cluster bleep year, it's part of a well understood cycle. This should not be news to any of us. We just haven't really been focusing on the right things. So the 20,000-foot view here is the fact that what we have been going through, and really what we started going through between 2005 and 2008, was a fundamental restructuring of the global economy. And many people talk about this within the lens of a recession. And we know that recessions are always going to dot the landscape. They're indicative of boom and bust cycles that we've always gone through. But when extrapolated out, we saw that what we were going through was something far greater. And it was a transformation that was brought on by convergences of new technologies that basically dropped money to the bottom line. So you couldn't make money off of that core technology anymore or employ people around it anymore. So you had to migrate up to the next higher order value proposition. And we're still in the throes of this transformation right now. And it's pushing people out of work. A lot of this is due to the disintermediation of human labor, which is what I'm going to talk about with the construction of the competency tree. But we saw everything that we thought we knew and what we had built our society on and our capitalistic structures on. We thought a lot of these things were crumbling, but actually they were just going through a major evolution. Now the 2,000-foot view a major part of that transformation was catapulted by something that we call templosion. Uh, and I always say I love making up new words because honestly, in order to really understand where the future is going, we can't get stuck using existing vocabulary. We have to invent and create our own. So templosion really is meant to describe the fact that very big things, the biggest of things, the biggest of events are happening in shorter and shorter periods of time. So it's as if we are experiencing time on steroids. And when I used to do a similar presentation in front of actual people and audiences, I used to do a raise of hands, and I would say, if a luxury today, or if a luxury is defined as something that is in high demand and short supply, what in your lives today is a luxury? And everyone would always say, time, time, time. I always joke there was the one guy in the back of a dark, crowded ballroom that yelled out, sex. I was like, no, not what we're talking about here. Time, and time is always that number one answer. Because it's something that we are looking to leverage. It's something that we're looking to amplify, manipulate, and control in completely new ways. And ultimately, time is the currency today. And time is what was driving, that compression of time was driving the transformation of the economy. And these continued compressions of time are also driving our pandemic response, because things that used to take years, if not several months of complicated R&D, are now happening in shorter and shorter bursts because of urgency of the market. So everything that we're seeing, from strategic and financial planning cycles, to even the way in which we communicate, to even traditional generational demarcations, all of these things are becoming more and more truncated. So that brings us to where we are now. So without that foundational understanding, we can't understand the fact that what we are going through is something that I would call the accelerator effect. And whole industries right now, entire industries, regardless of what that particular industry is, are being forced to pivot in near real time. And one of the critical points of this too is that they're not just pivoting in real time, but it is happening permanently. These changes are permanent in response to these unprecedented conditions. So businesses are being forced to re-engineer their entire operations, their entire supply chains, and their entire workforces to prevent future disruptions from putting them out of existence. Because we know that ultimately, and this is really the point of the competency tree too, is it's about future proofing. We know that we're going to go through existential crises like this again. This is not going to be the only time, and this very likely, particularly with climate change, is not going to be the only pandemic that we go through. So we need to think about enterprise risk management and how we actually position ourselves to capitalize on those opportunities in the future. And one of the things that we're seeing, I talked about the fact that our foot has been put on the gas here. This is amplifying many of the trends that we have identified over the years. This is amplifying it, and these trends are gaining momentum. Everything from automated retail and the rise of contactless consumerism, the rise of autonomous vehicles and delivery drones. There's new urgency around that as well, especially because humans used to crave more human-to-human touch points, but much of that is going away because we're fearful of putting in robotic replacements because of COVID. We're seeing more integration of technology like augmented reality and virtual reality, and not just in traditional sectors that really catapulted these, like retail or even hospitality, but across sectors. We're seeing a resurgence in the utility of 3D printing, something too that was always considered slightly niche. But now we're seeing 3D printing merge with crowdsourcing. And again, when the urgency presents itself, the fact that crowdsourced 3D printed ventilators are able to hit the market so quickly is a tremendous example of not just innovation, but extreme innovation. The continued rise of robotic medicine and telemedicine. So this brings us to an inflection point. This brings us to a really critical crossroads. And I know one of the things that Mark wanted me to talk about today, and one of the things that has been bubbling up both in my world and I know for Mark's group here, is really rethinking what the future of education looks like in all of this. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the next handful of minutes before we go to the framework and we can have a more open conversation about that. So one of the things that I've been talking about over the last few months is that because the future does not require adaptation, it requires us in many ways to go back to square one. But going back to square one, and this is an important point here, it doesn't mean looking to the past. It means that we have a completely new canvas on which to experiment. So if we are the artists and we can create anything that we want, but we need to start really thinking over about all of those structures and all of those institutions that were appropriate for a prior economy that we just go back to from a default because we don't know how to adequately imagine around them. And education is a clear case in point, because I've long been saying, and this is a soapbox of mine, is that the future will not just be about education, it will be about learning. And we need to reframe the narrative here because it's not going to be about traditional education and it's not going to be about traditional teaching, particularly when we have all of these technological tools at our disposal that we know are becoming more commoditized and more democratized because they're getting cheaper and they're being put in the hands of more people. It's going to be less about credentialized teaching and more about how to view a teacher as someone who walks you through immersive and highly sensorial virtual gaming experiences or virtual reality experiences where you can have things that hack the brain essentially and take you on a journey in a fraction of the time. If time is the new luxury value proposition here, why are we still committed to input-based metrics of getting students to school at a certain period of time when we can just tap directly into their minds and brains differently and take them on a completely new journey of learning? Because right now we still focus on the wrong things. We focus on teaching children with the rise of STEM and then STEAM, which is great, but we're still teaching them how to be bankers, how to code, teaching to tests, linear thinking, getting from A to B to B to C. And we know that the minds of these young people are not oriented that way. They're not oriented in a straight line. And we know that these systems were appropriate, not just for my parents, but my great-grandparents and even my great-great-grandparents, because this was based on a prior era. And when I talk about the transformation of economies, I do so because it's a layering effect. In some way, we still are an industrialized era economy, but we cannot fashion our institutions and our organizations that way. So we are still stuck in an outdated mode, but yet when the students can't pay attention to what these teachers are teaching, we think that it is a problem with their brains and we overdiagnose ADD and ADHD. And while that is still a real problem, we are forgetting the fact that Gen Z, and we call them cybrids, cyber hybrids, this is a generation that is in many ways reprogrammed by the earliest exposure to technology, such that we know that we are creating and growing different brains. Now, longitudinally, we don't necessarily know what this is going to mean. And we're just now starting to see some of the implications of them moving into the workplace. But this is going to be most profound with the youngest of these cybrids, whose brains are formed in an interconnected web-like pattern. But yet when you put them into something that then wants them to think in a straight line, it's like putting a square peg in a round hole. And we try to change the brain without changing the structure. So what is happening now? And I'm sure any of you with kids who are going through online learning have seen this. What is happening now? This is just a Band-Aid. This is wholly unsustainable. How we have been reacting to the pandemic with the rise of online learning cannot continue the way that it is. And even a hybridized approach isn't going to get us to where we need to go. We've seen a whole multitude of issues, everything from isolation to stress to anxiety to poor internet connectivity. This is exacerbating the have and have not divide. We see underserved areas really struggling here. We see students struggling with fading attention spans. There's lack of consistency. There are parents who are unavailable to help because of work demands. I have a 3-year-old who is on the other side of this door with my husband right now, trying to keep him quiet because he can't even go into daycare. So particularly any parents are juggling these two realities simultaneously, and juxtapose that against the fact that teachers have been thrust into this environment of which they have very little to no experience with online learning tools and were never trained. When we talk about the heroes of all of this, teachers are amongst them because they had to pivot also in near real time. Many people for years have talked about the fact that modern colleges were overdue for major changes. There were bloated budgets, crippling tuitions, and all of this has also been unsustainable. And the pandemic is accelerating that change. Just a quick anecdote, my parents' neighbor, their son got accepted to Northwestern. he was able to do online learning, but the parents are saying, we've saved for years for his tuition. How are we possibly going to justify $60,000 of tuition for him to sit at home in front of a computer screen? So a lot of people are grappling with these issues because that's the thing. It's like students have experienced online learning, but it's going to be significantly more difficult for colleges to convince them that they should go hundreds of $1,000s of debt into studying solely on campus or solely at home. So forward-thinking colleges and universities will have to begin offering degree programs online, but tuitions are going to have to be much lower than what on-campus students pay. And successful colleges ultimately will morph. I liken them to what successful retailers have done, where they adopted multiple revenue streams. They had brick and mortar, they had digital e-commerce, some morphed to virtual learning. But one of the critical points in all of this here too is that online classes were always viewed as a backup plan. This essentially, they were never viewed strategically. This was always a default for those who couldn't hack it or afford in-person colleges and universities. But now some of these stigmas and these stereotypes about learning, these perceptions are beginning to shift. So any higher ed or any educational institution across the board is going to have to ask itself, in this new reality, how do we become not only recession proof, but pandemic proof? And it's not going to be a one size fits all solution. You know, I talked a little bit about virtual reality. In our shop, we define that as tricking the brain into believing it's somewhere else doing something else in real time. Google Expedition is playing around with trying to blend the boundaries between time and space, take students immediately in real time to, let's say, explore the Egyptian Sphinx or the Great Barrier Reef. Augmented reality is something that other people are experimenting with, that's bridging the gap between the virtual and physical worlds. And then there's holographic technology, where students in London, actually last year at the Imperial College Business School, watched lectures delivered by holograms. And this was actually prior to COVID, but takes on greater urgency post-COVID, because the holograms appeared as 3D life-size models, and they could engage with students in real time, respond to questions in real time. And interestingly enough, because those boundaries between time and space are being blurred, the school was able to host one lecture in multiple locations simultaneously. So that brings us to where we are now. And in thinking about education and in thinking about what we are actually preparing our students for, I went down a rabbit hole about a year ago, maybe a couple of years ago, when I really thought to answer a few questions. One, with the continued disintermediation of human labor, not only how are people going to be employed, but how do we have to educate them differently throughout the entire lifespan, not just at the earliest onset of education, but throughout their entire careers? How do we educate them differently so that they are not disintermediated, how they are not basically victims through this wave of automation, and how ultimately can they future-proof themselves? So I created what I called the competency tree. Now let me do a share screen here. Blah, blah, blah. Let's pull this up. Sorry, I'm so bad at this. Competency tree. There we go. I'm assuming everybody can see this. So I created this framework here. And
actually, I think you're showing your like Finder view.
Oh, no.
You have to do a share screen, hit the share screen again, and you'll see where it is on your computer.
Okay, sorry. I had this happen once in a presentation. I was so spastic. I talk about technology, and yet I am such a Neanderthal with it. Okay, so share screen. Not this, advanced, files.
I have it. If you want me to.
Yeah, Mark, can you just pull it up for me, please? It'll be so much easier.
Yep. Well, first, I'll just blow it up. Right? 1 second.
Yeah, so as you're doing that, I'll walk you guys through. So I created it in the shape of a tree because the thing here is that nothing in the future is fixed. Everything is biological and organic in nature. And we talk about things still in a very kind of mechanistic, through a very mechanistic lens. Uh, and a lot of these things I realized were talked about as if they were one-offs. We talked about the need for critical thinking or empathy or creativity without really understanding the interrelationship between all of them. And, I passed this out to my clients and I said to them, for anyone in strategy, innovation, even HR, C-suite, it doesn't really matter where you are functionally within the organization, but circle the things that matter to you, circle the things that you want to hire around, circle the things that you want to train around, and even create your own branches and sub branches. Because again, it comes down to one fundamental thing, and that is future proofing. So, and anyone that knows me, which is not a lot of people on this call, but I'm a nerd that loves acronyms. So the acronym here, PLANT, because it is a tree, stands for the 5 core competencies. But I want to touch first on the trunk. And that trunk of the tree, which is what really props up all of the other branches, is human intelligence. And we talk about smart and intelligence out of the same side of our mouth, when in fact they're very different things. And I've long talked about the fact that the future is not going to be around smart, and we need to stop talking about smart, and we need to stop training around smart, because smart is based on rote memorization. It is based on linear thinking, and that's what I talked about before. Smart is going onto software and it is being automated. So we cannot train or educate around that anymore. We have to think in terms of intelligence. And intelligence requires critical thinking, and true critical thinking, and figuring out the solution to a problem when you've never been faced with that problem before. So that is what is propping up this tree. And so let's kind of go through each branch here, and then we can open this up to conversation. So that first branch is purpose and passion. And these two things are never really talked about as core competencies, but this encapsulates everything from promoting a sense of inspiration and motivation, not just for yourself, but your people internally, creativity, design thinking. And I've long said that the future is going to be not just about design, but the creation of design-based thinking is a core managerial competency, because it would always be like the chief design officer in the corner, making his or her like cool designs and informing the rest of the organization about it. But now it has to be embedded within all facets of any company, particularly as we spend more of our time being creative and thinking creatively. And there's also a very intimate relationship here between work, self-reliance, purpose, dignity, and meaning. Now, there's an offshoot of people called the post-workists, and they're thinking about kind of this utopian time when we're able to decouple ourselves from capitalism and just go to kind of like this renewed sense of, it's like a human renaissance of thought. Now, do I think we're necessarily going to get there anytime soon? No. But it's an interesting way to think about the fact that if we are able to basically rise above a lot of the drudgery and a lot of the tasks that we can just defer to artificial intelligence, what does that do to transform our own thinking and our way in which we can actually tap into human purpose and passion in new ways? Literacy is another core offshoot of this. This is everything from media literacy, the ability to discern what is real and what is fake, what is true and what is false. I read last year, it was a study that came out of Stanford that I think it was something like 86% of 8th graders were not able to tell the difference between real and sponsored content online. So there is a real vacuum of media literacy out there. So being able to teach people what is even real or what was created by a bot on Twitter, and that is interrelated to everything that's happening with analytical and critical thinking. Data literacy is a core part of this, STEM going into STEAM, where the A we know is arts. Social literacy, so social and cross-cultural literacy. Emotional literacy, so combining the emotional quotient, the EQ, with empathy. And then there's another one that I want to touch on, which is not on this tree, but is in the one that I can send Mark to send around to all of you, because I've made some updates to it, which is visual literacy. with Templosion, we know that much more of our communication is getting truncated and happening visually, whether it's through even something as silly as Snapchat all the way to memes and GIFs. There's actually a new job emerging from all of this, which is a regional emoji detector. And it sounds so ridiculous, but this is someone who is brought into court cases that can help people discern the ambiguities in the text messages involving emojis. And that's a core competency in a lot of ways and a growth area in the future. And again, I try to remove my own value judgments because I'm like, that sounds ridiculous. But visual literacy is going to be a core part of this. Analytical and critical thinking. This really is all about a multidisciplinary foundation to knowledge and thought, ultimately so that independent ideas can be put within kind of a more proper framework. It's all about understanding, learning, and knowing more about things, giving people meaning to their collective experiences, problem solving, and wisdom and judgment are also core offshoots of this branch. The N is nimbleness. And I kind of railed against adaptability in the beginning, but being adaptable internal to an organization, being adaptable at work has taken on greater urgency, and lifelong learning. And I would say the future is even less about lifelong learning, as it is more about lifelong forgetting. We need to get comfortable forgetting all of the information and the knowledge that we have acquired that does not serve us for the future. So it's not just about gaining access to new ways of learning, but it's also new ways of forgetting. And then the last piece of this is trust. The things that you see here in those two boxes, it's trust between humans and humans, but it's also humans and what I call non-carbon life forms. So these are all of the systems, the electronic entities, the AI systems, the algorithms, a lot of these things that are controlling much more of our lives, monitoring what it is that we do at work. So there's greater need for honesty, which is a big part of this, but also authenticity, transparency, and judgment. Now, one of the things that is not on this tree, and Mark heard me present on this yesterday, and it was yesterday because I just created this yesterday, is I was thinking about this tree and what I created prior to the pandemic and how to expand on this tree kind of in this post-pandemic world. And I thought that this is not necessarily a wholly complete picture because we're only looking at how it grows up from human intelligence, not below. So an addendum to this is what I'm calling roots. And that is a root structure. And it's an acronym too, because I love acronyms, with the ROOTS being the 5 aspects that feed into human intelligence that increasingly we need to look at, especially in a world that's going to be more about virtual and flexible work. So the R is resiliency. This is kind of the rubber ball effect. It's what everybody is talking about now with our own ability to bounce back. But it's also cultivating a belief in yourself, in your own ability to cope and cope with kind of major existential threats like what we are dealing with now. The first O is outlook. It's how you choose to view the world. It's not just about have and have nots, but it's about can and cannots. And it's about a belief that the future can be seen differently. The next O is objectivity. And I've long said that the hardest part of my job and what it is that we do is removing the blinders, the value judgments, the heuristics, the personal biases, keeping those to a minimum and really seeing through those new eyes and keeping a realistic perspective. The T is tenacity. A lot of people now too are talking about how to instill a sense of grit, a sense of perseverance, and that goes hand in hand with resiliency. It's all about inner strength and a mental toughness. And then the S is self-regulation. And this is ability to self-manage disruptive emotions, impulses, despite the unpredictability of the world. And we know that the one certainty of the world now and increasingly in the future is that we can be guaranteed unpredictability. So how we choose to regulate it and how we choose to manage it is within our control. So ultimately, to put a bow on all of this, this tree is meant solely just as kind of a modeling outline. This is an example of how my mind works, but it is by no means fixed. It's also just a way to help visualize potential arenas for future jobs, even the ones that we have yet to imagine, like that ridiculous one that's being created around court cases and emojis. Because ultimately, when it comes down to future proofing, it's less about picking a safe job, and it's more about constantly updating the skills in this tree throughout your entire career. And education, going back to education for a second, it needs to change dramatically if workers are going to adapt to this new environment. If this is what we're training for, how do we educate around it differently? Because ultimately, when it comes down to whether it's talent management, talent acquisition, human capital, workforce strategy throughout all levels of the organization, we have to ultimately rethink how we hire for, train for, and prepare for all of the aspects that I talked about in the competency tree. So with that, I will end there. I think we have some time for Q&A. I haven't looked at any of the comments in the chat, but Mark, if you want to maybe manage a couple questions, I'd be happy to answer some. And then I will also send you the updated competency tree, Mark, if you would like to add that to the app, because you heard the update in real time yesterday.
Perfect. So thoughts, questions?
Okay,
Sarah.
I have to speak. This is amazing. I love your work. I am so grateful for you presenting this. And it's, you've given so much thought. I teach at Southern New Hampshire University, organizational analysis and social entrepreneurial leadership to doctoral students in the Ed Leadership program. And this is going to be a real good tool for me to share with them if I have your permission. Or I'd love to have you speak to them. The other thing I just want to share, and then I'll stop talking, is I love the roots. My research and dissertation is all around resilience and beliefs in oneself, beliefs in others. And the only comment that I would make is I would look at the difference. We talk a lot about the difference between the word resilience and resiliency. And resilience is a process, not a trait. And so the research around resilience is encouraging people to use the word resilience instead of resiliency, because resiliency often connotes people may think of it as a trait instead of a process.
That's a great point, Sarah. I like that point. Yeah.
And I'm totally digging this, and you know, you and I are going to talk later.
We know you're digging it because you got up at 5:30 in the morning.
I know it.
Right.
I know it. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Erica.
What are other people thinking broadly about this? Francis, you're at you know, you're 9 o'clock in the evening. So what are you thinking about this?
The first thought that comes to mind is the difference of why the U.S. is so well positioned for the future. Because when I look at many of the markets that I do most of my work in Asia, I see that so many of these traits are missing both in the education system and the way that society functions. And so this gives me actually a renewed sense of hope or excitement about the future of the U.S. versus global competitors.
Yeah, and Francis, that's a really good point. And I've been looking a lot at the Chinese model for education, and the fact that so much has been just about that one offshoot off of data literacy, because obviously they teach to the national test, and it's based largely on this linear thinking that I'm talking about. And these students are going through burnout, but yet they're actually grappling with some of the same questions that we are as they look to how to cultivate these softer skills. And they're actually wondering if empathy is something that can be taught or if we are born with it. And that's kind of a big existential question because we don't know. It's the old kind of nature v nurture debate. So they're looking at ways to even leverage a lot of those technologies I talk about. which everything honestly comes out of Asia first, whether it's VR, AR, robotic teachers, or holographic tech. It's all being prototyped there first. But they're looking at an interesting, I think, hybridized model, not in the way that we are, but in a way where they're actually using technology to cultivate some of these softer things that I talked about in the tree.
But if I look around the tree, Erica, I actually can't see one area where China is doing a good job.
No, and that's why I say in the roots, like the objectivity part, it's really hard to kind of keep my own value judgments out of the equation. So yes, good, bad, it's all relative. But you know, Mark knows one of the themes that we talked about in yesterday's meeting was kind of this digital Berlin Wall and the rise of techno-nationalism between US and China. And that's a conversation for another day and what's happening there. But one of the biggest existential threats in that is the fact that a lot of talent, either coming out of the US, but also mostly coming out of China, is going to be stuck basically within physical boundaries of these countries because we're holding on to our talents so tightly. So it'll be interesting to see too, kind of how this kind of quote unquote Cold War affects talent composition, talent acquisition, and education.
Yep. Much like a tree, I'm not sure that the roots will hold in the soil here.
Well, that's a topic for that Asia deep dive. It could be a subset topic. Other thoughts? How about I keep on calling you, Eddie, for the European perspective, maybe towards education, maybe or any other thing that you're seeing here that might resonate or you may question.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you, Erica. This is incredible. It's really good stuff. I've been writing notes left and right. What always struck me for a large part of American education, particularly K through 12, is that it was relatively little focused on critical thinking and a lot of repetition versus our education in Western Europe. And I think that's coming back to your tree and analytical and critical thinking, which without it we're lost because we don't know what in the world is right and wrong, visually, mentally, etc. Interestingly enough, little anecdote: we put our youngest daughter in a Chinese school this year. The public school she went to was inadequate in changing from an offline to an online environment. And she was done in an hour and a half and wasn't interested in learning anymore, which is obviously the most terrible thing when you're a kid. And our minds are blown by the way they completely rethought the curriculum, much like all your tree trunks. Developing all actually the skills that you of the PLANT that you wrote there. They touched on all of them in a different way. And she's now learning Mandarin, but also how to apply Mandarin in math, for example. And really, they're really stretching her mind from 8 to 3. It's kind of incredible to notice the difference in learning, and it's very eclectic international school called BASIS, and so this is spot on for me, and it confirms my earlier thought that we do well with learning from other cultures, particularly Asian cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why that social literacy piece, it's not just about having a global perspective, but it really is about cross-cultural and about taking kind of the best practices and applying them, and not just paying it lip service, but actually implementing them in a way that matters.
That's right. That's right, and not being stuck in one paradigm, which obviously in the public school system in the U.S. That's very hard to change. We all know that. But private schools can I think meander a little faster, particularly when the route is international.
Other questions, thoughts, comments?
Yeah, Erica, this is John Pagley. Thank you for your presentation. Absolutely brilliant, fascinating, intriguing. I put in chat, and I don't know if that was picked up. How would your thoughts be implemented? What is the critical path to implementation? And I guess that kind of echoes the preceding question in a way.
Well, yeah, so you wrote there.
Erica, or is it me?
Sounds like you might have cut out, Erica.
And sorry, I have
You're still robotic, but we at least can hear you.
a little note my connection. Okay, sorry about that.
There you go.
You would think that in a New York City apartment building, I wouldn't have problems with Wi-Fi, but so John, just to quickly answer your question, because this is such a huge thing, or what are the paths to get there? We have a series of what we call our thinking technologies, and we created these thinking technologies a long time ago because one of the biggest impediments to learning, and I'm not going to tackle the future of education and my solutions to it today, but one of the biggest impediments to learning, I think, goes back to this objectivity piece, because we get in our own way. And we take a lot of our clients through an exercise that sounds really silly, but actually helps open up those pathways, which is called the recognition of educated incapacity, but how to see through alien eyes. And educated incapacity is basically knowing so much about what it is that you know, that you're the last to be able to see the future for it differently. And I say that because, if I wanted to find out about the future of healthcare, the last person I would ask would be a doctor, and so on and so forth. And we'll take people through this exercise, saying, if an alien came down from another planet and saw what the world looked like, what would you actually see? And it just gets people comfortable flipping their perspectives. It's kind of the Rubens vase example of the optical illusion, where, if you see it one way, it's a vase, and it's also the profile of two faces. If you're stuck only seeing the vase, you're seeing a market for all of the things that you would sell a vase into. You see the profile of two faces, you're seeing a totally different market and a completely different path to thinking, just completely differently. But yet we're trapped within the way in which we view things. It's human nature to see one or the other, not both. So how do we think in terms of both? And how do you kind of move the foreground back and the background forward and capitalize on things that are not in plain, or that are in plain sight? We just haven't been trained to see them. So it's just a way, it's kind of a mental exercise that I think we can always do. It's how I try to even identify trends, is through this kind of figure ground optical illusion, to say, what are the things that I'm just not seeing because I'm not training myself to see it? And again, it's not about reinventing the wheel. It's the lowest hanging fruit, but it can drop money to the bottom line and be a huge differentiator and get us to think critically and analytically about our businesses without going through all of this rigmarole. It's really just changing our mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So a few other questions. I'm going to violate my 10-minute break rule. Maybe we'll take a 10-minute break at 9. We'll keep the Q&A going.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I love the presentation and the visuals, the symbolism. There's so many implications in nature that we can learn from. And I threw in the chat an example of a book called Wise Trees, which essentially tells many, many stories. It's a photographic history and learning, but it essentially talks about interconnectedness and the interdependence within nature, and how there's really symbiotic relationships that are beneficial. I learned a lot through a conservation environmentalist this past spring when we were working on an educational project, and he is a former leadership development boss and now retired and is a land steward. But it's a fascinating visual that you've selected to talk about the interconnectedness and how there are many, many considerations for education. So thank you for this.
You know, I had a visual as you were talking, Leslie, because we both went to Denison, which is, you know, small, like under 10 students per professor. It's the professorial mentors. And I'd like to get the professors into our ecosystem. We started to do that with Denison. I think that, you know, you were teaching, Sarah. I think there are others here, and some who just really don't think our university system is A, gives return on investment, or B, is preparing people properly. So
Totally. And I would
let's have
really
that debate.
help you and support you with that. Totally.
Who else? Tom, you put yourself off mute. Did you want to ask? You want to say something? Or anyone else?
I think it's absolutely brilliant. You know, I love kind of the way you framed out this thing. I mean, I think I'm a brand guy, you know, and I look at this as a model for how you'd want to build any great company, any great organization, any great brand, you know, in terms of how do you find that, you know, quantum next stage of growth in an organization. And because it's kind of giving you kind of a pathway. And some of the great brands are already behaving in some of these ways. But I think this is just a really good holistic way of, and here's what it's going to take to kind of reboot and rebuild your organization, your brand, your company, whatever's important to you, right? Whether you're investing in it or leading it. The challenge does become, and, you know, I think, Erica, I'm sure you face this as have I, is how do you kind of get there, right? And I've kind of come to the realization with most companies, it's almost like, you know, you have to build a new plane while you're flying the plane, right? Or you have to think about two companies. Who's run the company today, right? Where you have to deliver to shareholders over the next 12 to 18 months. And how do you find a way to build the company of tomorrow around kind of a framework like this that I think will allow you to thrive into, you know, a future that is just going to rapidly change. So I think it's a really, really great framework. And you need really great leadership to help an organization kind of get you through the pathway and begin to operationalize some of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and you're kind of touching on the one piece that I intentionally did not put in this tree because of the very point that you're making, which is the culture piece. Because that's the lens through which a lot of this is viewed. And that's why I've always said to any of our companies and any brands that I've worked with in particular, because they know the internal culture. So within this framework, pick the pieces that you think will
That's too bad.
really resonate, because this is not just a one size with it. It's pick the things that really matter and then create your own offshoots. So for brands, you know, the trust piece in particular is a huge one for them. So how to really cultivate that differently. And you know, there's no piece of this that I don't think will touch anybody, but there are what you can't focus on 5 and then the 5 roots simultaneously. But that drill piece is a big part of this as well. And I just want to say too, this and then a bunch of other content too. And this is by no means a sales pitch because we're a small family business.
Well, I was about to make one for you.
What's that?
I was about to make one.
We have kind of our
Sorry, go ahead.
Friends report for 2020. So if any of you guys want that, it's on our website. So you can just go sign up. You'll receive this. And it's a compendium of this and probably like a dozen of other trends in easily kind of digestible format. But it's a nice way to also kind of contextualize this within some of the other macro forces that I talked about. If anyone just wants some more mind candy.
This is a mind candy crowd. What I was going to say is that Erica and I have been thinking of I think our worlds separate makes sense, but there's some ways where we want to have whether it's a monthly or quarterly, where our worlds get together. You know, for those who are not only just dollars and cents, but lateral, interesting thinkers, or maybe C-suite people. Because in her world is really like chief innovation officers, chief marketing officers, head of strategy for Fortune 500,000 companies, and some entrepreneurs. I made one chat comment and had like eight people that I've interacted with. Some Michigan, some just I could connect my venture world to those entrepreneurs. It's been a great. Thanks to Tom for introducing us. Any last question before? Because I do want to. One thing I learned from her is that she offered a break. I think we all need like a little break before we jump into these.
Can I ask one more question? Because I find it so fascinating. Have you done work with sort of head of HRs of large organization to sort of operationalize some of the main tenets you're looking for future leaders, and how to screen for it?
Oh man, so Eddie, that is a conversation that we need to have offline, because Mark will kill me with all of the things that I have to say about that, because I'll eat into the entire break. We have worked with dozens upon dozens of CHROs over the years. And I'm going to speak very candidly. We want to bang our head up against a wall, because that is probably one of the last functional areas within any organization that is willing, that they are even calling themselves human resources, is indicative of the fact that they are stuck in an old model, because we're hiring half humans and half systems. They are valuing the wrong things. And talk about, again, something functional that is still operating within a largely industrialized era way. HR.
I'm supportive is the short answer, but we'll talk about how to deliver. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah. You're not muted. But yeah, that conversation happy to have offline, because I have a lot of observations there. And Mark, actually, in my first presentation, I talked a little bit about the blinders that HR has.
Great.
So. Yeah, that's the big one.
I'm seeing that there's some new people who join in, because I had told them there would be breakouts by university. And so maybe could you do this? I'm going to push, can you maybe let everybody know who maybe have missed it, so sort of some of the key themes that you talked about, maybe a couple questions for them to consider in the breakouts. And then we will do like maybe a 5-minute break, and I'll put everybody in these breakout rooms. But maybe you could do a recap and some questions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, for those who didn't hear this, I touched on a lot of the macro forces that are happening right now in, I don't want to even say a post-pandemic world, but one of the things that COVID has necessitated is our ability to just kind of identify a lot of the trends that have been kind of the foot on the gas. And I talked about this notion of templosion, the fact that time is speeding up, and we see that truer now than ever before. But I pivoted this time and talked about the future of education, that it needs to be rethought, that it's less about traditional education, more about learning. And if we are to understand what the new jobs of the future are going to be, and even how we organize our institutions and our organizations to really capitalize on where the future is going, we have to rethink the skills and the competencies that are exclusively in the human realm. There are many of which that are going onto software and are being automated in this time of rampant disintermediation. So we need to rethink what matters for human workers, how to educate around those differently, train around those differently. And ultimately, Mark, I think one of the critical questions here is, one, how do you future-proof your organization, and how do you future-proof your talent? So it's both about the structure of your company and the talent within it. So how do you leverage human capital in new ways and future-proof them? And then second question, which is something that actually just came up in the conversation, which I think is an interesting one to tackle, is what are the pathways with which to get there? So what are some actionable steps that we can take now? And
You're losing you, Erica.
you guys to think.
Erica, we're losing you. Maybe what I'll do is, what we'd like to do is I'll go back, take control of the slides. So for those who missed it, so this has been part of a 2-day event. We're finding ourselves having had the economist angle, the financial markets angle yesterday. Today, Erica touched on these macro forces that you saw. We had breakouts yesterday by these subjects, and today we're going to do them by alumni groups. Now, it's a diverse group, and if I had a screenshot of to show you how I've broken this out, but I've tried my best. I've got Denison and Michigan, and let's see, it looks like 3 or 4 of my Arthur Anderson people, and some people have come in and out. But if you're not assigned, we're going to take a 5-minute break anyways. Come back, and if you're assigned and you're only like one of 2 or 3 people at Stanford and you really didn't like them anyways, and you want to come back and mingle with others, just we'll put you in these groups, and then at like 9:35 we'll hit a button. We all come back together and sort of discuss what we learned about in these breakouts. And the theme of which is sort of take some of those macro forces or the compensatory issues and how it relates to you. Meanwhile, go network, share your stories and your asks. So I'm going to open the rooms to move around. But again, if you're not moved yet, if you want to move back, you just push these buttons to go into those rooms or to come back to this main room. And thank you again, Erica. And we'll be back here in a half an hour